Hi, everyone. My name is Beth Walsh, and I am joined by Bianca Martin. And we are here to talk with everyone today about crisis planning with families and what does this look like? Um, how can a crisis impact a family, and why planning can be an important factor in mitigating some of the stressors that occur during a crisis. This is it's a pretty big topic. Crisis really brings up a lot of feelings when we hear that word. So as you're watching this or beginning to watch this recording, I just want to kind of do some reminders about self-care in a way, creating a calm space, if you will, to take in this information, um, but also take care of yourself. So things like grabbing a cup of tea, getting comfy. I know we've all been home this last year, so comfy is probably the first outfit we find when we get up during the day. But getting comfy, breathing is important. I know for me personally, I tend to forget to breathe sometimes when I'm anxious. It's one of the symptoms that I get, and I know that that can be kind of can create some other physical problems. So just remembering to breathe, and then again, just having some self-care strategies ready to go if you're watching this. And the good news is this is a recording. So if you do need to pause the recording or take a step back, you're not going to miss anything. You're watching this in your own time, in your own space. So that's always a fun little tidbit as well. For this presentation, we are going to be going over a couple of things. We're going to do a little welcome overview of who we are, because you want to know who I am and who Bianca is. But also, we're going to talk about what is crisis. Then we're going to go into knowledge is power. And finally, we're going to end with the planning portion, the being prepared. So I know I mentioned our names earlier, but just a little bit more about who we are. Again, my name is Beth Walsh, and I am the Director of Children and Youth Programs with NAMI Virginia. And NAMI Virginia is a three-tiered organization. We have a national level, state level, and affiliate levels. And we work to support and educate and advocate for all Virginians who are impacted by mental illness. We also house what's called the Virginia Family Network. And what that is it is a contract agreement between us, NAMI Virginia, and the Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Services to create a network of parents who have children living with a mental health condition or mental health challenges. So we help to kind of bridge that gap and bring parents together and create that space for parents to connect with each other so they have that extra support system in place. So that's a little bit about me and my background. I'm going to pass it on over to Bianca to talk about who she is.
Hi, everyone. I'm Bianca Martin. I am the Outreach and Family Support Specialist, and I currently work with a nonprofit organization called Formed Families Forward. Formed Families is a family-led resource center in Northern Virginia, and we support foster, adoptive, and kinship families who are raising children, youth, and young adults with special needs, and professionals who work with our families. And really, we have several families that work with us that have lived experience, which is exciting that I am going to get to share a little bit of my lived experience in the crisis world.
Yes. Thank you so much, Bianca. That's definitely one of the things that we really talk a lot about at, Form Families Forward and Virginia Family Network is that peer connection and being able to learn from each other's experiences and offering that up as assistance for each other. All right, so let's dive on in here. What is a crisis? A crisis is a big word. Again, we talked about this at the beginning, but again, it's a situation defined as a stressful time in an individual's life when they experience a breakdown or disruption in their usual or normal daily activities or family functioning. A crisis can be an event. It can, it's pretty much like I was saying, it could be individualized. It can impact multiple people at once. But for the purposes of this presentation, we're going to refer to crisis being a mental health crisis. So again, that is an event, and it impacts an individual, it impacts the child. It also impacts the family unit. Everybody is involved, becomes impacted by what the child is going through and how to manage that crisis in the moment. Um, when we define a mental health crisis, it's really an emergency in the fact that is the crisis is the child in imminent danger of hurting, themselves? Is the child in danger of hurting others? Or is the child having severely disorganized or dangerous thoughts? And these 3 points are what is categorized, if you will, as a mental health crisis. If you call someone for assistance, they will kind of go through these 3 red flags, if you will, to look out for. Um, there are other situations that we mentioned here that require an assessment or someone else to help de-escalate the situation. So if calling in a mobile crisis unit to come to a home to help de-escalate a child because they're feeling overwhelmed, or if the child responds to someone else more in a positive way as opposed to anybody who's in the family unit in the home, or as a parent, you don't know what else to do. So this might not be considered a mental health emergency crisis, but it can still feel like a crisis in a family unit, especially for parents if you don't know what to do or what's happening. And there's still support out there if you're in this position, not necessarily where the child hits those 3 markers that we mentioned earlier. All right, so we're going to turn it on over to Bianca, who's going to kind of start us off with the beginning portion of her story.
Okay, and so I love this picture so much. This is my family, and I am just pulling up. So my family consists of my husband that I've been with for 16 years, that's pictured here, and my son, who started out life as our nephew, who's now 12 years old. So at the age of 5, our son moved in with my husband and I as a foster child. Prior to moving with us, he was exposed to an extreme amount of neglect and abuse, causing him to show signs of complex post-traumatic stress disorder. So although he received support as a foster child, once we were awarded custody of him, all of our mental health supports and services disappeared. Unfortunately, the social workers and others involved in our case did not provide us with how to obtain these supports as custodial parents of a kinship child. We also did not have prior proper training to support a child with such a traumatic history. So during the span of 5 years, our son's biological mom requested constant visitation, which we all thought was the right thing to do. Unfortunately, at the time, we did not know the ramifications that this would have on our son long term. One summer week in the year of 2019, our son spent a total of 5 nights with his biological mother. The next day, our son appeared to be extremely emotionally dysregulated to the degree that he started to self-harm. He was only 10 years old at the time.
All right, so I know that we're recording this, so we're not really anticipating people to be able to respond in real time, but we do have some questions that, we want you to ponder as we move through this presentation. And if you do have further questions or we don't really respond to these questions later on in a way that is helpful, please let us know. We're here to help. And if you are watching this, we do have an event coming up on May 1st where I'll be available to do a Q&A to talk more about this process and help answer questions that you might have. But here are the questions. When your child was in crisis, if you had this happen, what are some things you wish you had known to feel prepared? And one other question is, are there gaps with the crisis or challenges? So did you notice any gaps in the system that you had to manage or challenges? And I don't know if Bianca had that experience or if she was like, wanted to shake her head yes, or be like, yeah, gaps, challenges, check. But we definitely have heard from multiple parents that can be the case. So just some things to ponder.
And just a quick note on that, I don't think that our system or the county or wherever we live, that it's intentional. I think that we are all learning as a community, and to be able to have a lived experience for our parents is the biggest gift that we can give our community back, and pay it forward with, yes, while we're in the middle of a crisis or the beginning of a crisis or even at the end, all of our stories contribute to which is the perfect segue for our next part of the presentation is knowledge is power.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like the system only changes when voices are heard and bring truth to situations that have occurred and might have been seen or known about until somebody can speak up and talk about it. So for those of you who are like, what is the system? Again, another really big word. First off, so what does a crisis look like in Virginia? What happens when there's a crisis? In Virginia, we have what's called the Community Services Board, or a CSB for short. And it is required by law, a CSB, to provide emergency mental health services for both adults and children. And CSBs are located in every county, region of the state. They're not regional, but they're definitely they cover definitely. There could be one that covers 5 counties. There could be one that covers 2 counties, but one of them involves a really big city. So it just depends on where you live. But where you live has a CSB. You just have to find it, and we'll talk about where to go for that later. But they're considered the mental health authority in the state of Virginia. And recently, part of this is that funding was provided to Virginia for crisis response services for children in each region. But I want to be very clear that this varies depending on where you live. So not every service is the same depending on the location, geographic location of the state. Some include mobile crisis units, some include crisis stabilization, some include having a child psychiatrist. But depending on where you live, that will look different. I know from experience, I'm from Southwest Virginia, and finding a child psychiatrist is very difficult. So that might not be a service that has been included as part of that region. And then there are other places that are involved in a crisis as well. Typically, again, emergency rooms, first responders such as police, private hospitals. These positions all play a role in what the crisis looks like in Virginia, what might occur for your family if, or when you find yourself in a crisis. So in Virginia, this is kind of a quick snapshot of what happens when you're in a crisis. First, police are respond to the situation. This is how it is currently in the state, unless the Community Service Board issues different guidance. So if you call for 911 or the emergency number at the CSB, this is potentially what's going to happen. A police officer will show up. The police officer will then bring the child in for assessment, and then there are 2 parts to this. There's what's called the emergency custody order. That's the first step. That is the 24-hour hold for anyone under 18. And this is where you get the general mental health assessment from a licensed mental health provider. If it's determined that more time is needed, a TDO will be issued, or a temporary detention order. This is the legal document. It requires immediate hospitalization so that there can be further evaluation, and that this gives and allows up to 120 hours for this lengthening to occur, so that people can the providers can really look at what's happening and determine next steps. The 120 hours is for anyone under 18. If you're watching this and you have a child over 18, it's not 120 hours. It's more, no, it's 72 hours, I believe. Do not quote me on that. It's not in front of me, but I've been working with children for a little bit longer. So the adult side tends to go off into the back burner sometimes. This is important, but if the minor is between 14 and 18, they can object to admission to a facility. So if you do have a child who's 14 to 18, a youth at that point, it's important to kind of talk through what might occur if a crisis does happen, and having that plan in place. So this is a really basic flow chart, if you will, to kind of give you, again, a visual of how of what happens when a child has a mental health crisis. And again, just so we know, a crisis is if the child is in danger of hurting themselves, a child is in danger of harming others, or they're destabilizing quite quickly. So you call for help. What does that look like? You call either the emergency number for the CSB or you call 911. You request a CIT officer. CIT stands for Crisis Intervention Trained Officers. So these are police officers who go through a specific training on how to respond to mental health crises. So that's why one of the things you need to ask when you call is, hey, we need a CIT officer. This is a mental health related call. The officer assesses the child and then would issue a paperless ECO. So again, that is what we talked about, that first initial hold, if you will, to do that assessment by a licensed mental health provider. And here we are, the mental health assessment occurs. Then the mental health provider will ask the magistrate for a TDO if that is considered to be necessary. Sometimes a crisis call ends at the ECO. It doesn't require, the mental health provider will come and do the assessment and determine that the child does not need further assessment. And so they will not request a TDO. But if you do move through a TDO, this is what this looks like. So you get the temporary detention order. The mental health worker looks for a bed. This can be a bit difficult because it's stated in Virginia we have to find an open bed. So if the open bed is not in a place near you currently, the child might end up in a facility that's further away. We've had some people end up like 4 hours away or 2 hours. So it's just a matter of finding an open bed. Then for the TDO, the child again is held for 120 hours. And after those 120 hours is typically protocol for the parent, the child, and the provider determine what they do next, because then they get released from the hospital. All right, so Bianca.
Thank you so much for that wonderful flow chart. I'm going to explain a little bit of my lived experience that was somewhat similar to this flow chart. Thankfully for me, as a former family support partner, I had a lot of knowledge and understanding of what to do during a crisis. So we knew that the situation was serious when our son told us that he needed help and admitted to us that he was not able to control himself from self-harming tendencies. So my first plan of action was to call my natural support, which was my sister in this case, to request that she come over and stay with our children. There's other children in my house, so she came over to stay with them. And I requested that she come over so that I was able to take my son to the hospital. And then my second step and plan of action was to call a local psychiatric hospital to request a bed. The hospital informed me that I would have to take my son to a medical hospital prior to being admitted to the psychiatric hospital. So the purpose of going to the medical hospital first was so that our son's wounds were examined and to be cleared medically. So unfortunately, a psychiatric hospital doesn't have that ability to medically clear a child. They're the mental health professionals, and they don't have, they probably have first aid kits, but they are not professionally trained medically. So that night, we did take our son to a local hospital for medical purposes. We spent 8 hours at that hospital, and we were eventually interviewed by a caseworker after our son was clear, and they looked at his wounds, and they gave him medical care. So the caseworker confirmed transferring our son to a psychiatric location. So we then rode in an ambulance to the local psychiatric hospital, and the intake process took about 2 hours. So once in his room, our son definitely experienced a major breakdown, which was really emotional for all of us, because I don't think that he initially thought he would be at the hospital more than one day. He ended up spending a total of 7 days in the psychiatric hospital, with us being able to visit him daily and speak to him on the phone as well. So in that time frame, he became stable due to medication changes. And after that incident, our family had to make the difficult decision to decrease visitation with his biological parents. We then became part of the quote unquote system to include this community service board, which is the CSB. Our family self-referred to the Children's Services Act, which is also known as the CSA, and we then became part of family resource meetings, which are also known as family FRMs, excuse me. And then we got involved in our school IEP's planning process. I did request a family support partner, which is a volunteered position that you can say yes or no to. And then yes, of course, last but not least was safety planning with all of the team involved.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Bianca. And you brought up a good point, which is not necessarily discussed in the crisis system in Virginia, because there are multiple ways to kind of navigate this, and going at it as a family and bringing the child initially to the hospital is definitely one of those options. Typically the police officer call is in that case where the parent and or caregiver feels that they are in an unsafe environment. The child is going to be. But the thing about medically clearing, I think, is an important thing to mention, because just a little tidbit about medical clearing. Sometimes a UTI, and not many people know this, but UTI goes unchecked or what's the word I'm looking for? Cared for, like unmedicated, like untreated. There it is, untreated. Some of the symptoms can manifest as psychosis. And so having a medical clearance initially can help rule out some of those things that could potentially occur. I'm not saying this happens every time. I'm saying that that's why medical clearance is important too. It's just to make sure everything is going okay physically before moving to the next step. So I'm glad you brought that up. And also the plan. So Bianca kind of took her story and really ran with it with the next steps, what became part of her, I want to say, network in the system, like who became a part of that, who played a role. And so knowing those those pieces is going to be important in making a plan. And I like to say, and if you've listened to our video for Stress Awareness Month that I was on, you'll hear me say this, but I always say it's better to have, what is it? To need and have than wait. Whenever I try to bring up a quote on a recording, I always forget it. It's better to have and not need than to need and not have.
There you go.
Woohoo! I know it's going to happen. So making a plan. So we want families to be empowered in this process, in my mind, feeling prepared and knowing what's going to happen is a way to kind of take some of that power and to know what, and to have that control. Again, not every child is going to need crisis services, and we understand that. But I think it's still important to know what the system looks like and what's available in this system, just to have a plan and just in case. Because really, again, just in case is not a bad thing. It can be helpful in calming nerves and really having, again, that control and that power in the situation. And I mentioned here on the slide that situations are stressful and require quick action. So having a plan in place really helps to keep some of those nerves down and to ease the stressors that come up. So if you have a plan, you're not standing there going, what do I do? What do I do? You have a plan. So it might take you a minute in the moment to go, what do I do? Wait, I have a plan. Where do I keep my plan? Here's my plan. That's understandable, but to kind of have it helps you move through it a little bit faster. This will, again, ensure that not only what services are available, but those steps that are in place to help your family through the process. So, what are some questions to ask when you're making a plan? And these are some basic ones that come up in our plan that we have on our website, which I'll be sharing at the end of this. But some things to consider: what hospital will you use for emergency visit? Like Bianca mentioned in her story that she went to the psychiatric hospital nearby, so knowing where that is. How will you transport your child safely? This is important. Bianca mentioned, her child was in a place where she could transport him. But again, sometimes you might not be at that position and you might have to call 911 or call the emergency number at the CSB. And they may recommend a police escort. If not, if you don't have a transportation, who do you call? I just mentioned the CSB, 911. If you have more than one child in the household, what will happen with those children? Who's going to take care of them? Bianca had this exact thing happen to her. She had to call her sister to come over to her house to watch the other children that were at the home at the time. So having these kind of knowing who your natural supports are, or those people that you keep close by who know that they're on call if you ever need them, is really, really important. Again, are there other friends and family members that can support you, that you can put down on your list to call during this moment? Very, very important. Crisis planning is a collaborative process. It's not just one person in the family making the decisions. It should be all the family members who live in the household being part of that process, because a crisis, again, does not just impact one person, it impacts the whole family unit. So making sure that everyone has a voice in that process is extremely important. So here are some tips to think about before a crisis occurs. Again, this is a planning thing. We want to say crises will never occur, but again, it's always helpful to be prepared. So first thing is, if you have health insurance, to contact the insurer, and to see if they have a specific provider or hospital network that they cover. This is like one of those details that you don't think about until after the fact, and you're being told, I'm so sorry, this was not covered under your insurance. This is actually just a really good tip for anything related to health. Is just to make sure that you are covered. Familiarize yourself with the facility that is covered or that you will be putting down on your list. See, can they accept the child? Is there an age limit? Are there restrictions? Are you allowed to visit? What are the visitation plans for the facility? How many beds do they have? What's their typical change up, like how many people are typically in the facility at a time? Like those just like little details that you might want to ask to feel like you have some sort of handle on their process. If you know that you might be using the police, and again, I know that's a really tough topic, and we don't take this lightly. So we don't want to say we're going to use the police, but again, these are things to do beforehand if ever you need to use them. So just to contact the department and kind of introduce yourself and provide information about your child, so that if you ever do have to call for a crisis, then they know who you are. They're like, oh, this is Joe's mom calling. Joe's having a mental health crisis, and it might be his like second crisis in 6 months, but they know the family and they know you, and they understand what a mental health crisis might look like for your family. It really helps to bridge that gap in a way and create kind of a partnership in the process, and not feel like you're alone in that. We mentioned this earlier, but this kind of goes into familiarizing yourself with the facility, but just visiting the hospital ahead of time, like to just become familiar with the basics of how the hospital is laid out. I know for me personally, every time I go to a hospital, I get turned around no matter what. Hospitals are very confusing. There are a lot of different areas. Every hospital is different. No hospital is the same. I mean, they all have the same units mostly, but they're all set up differently. So it's important to kind of get a feel and feel comfortable in that situation as well. And then just to do research and keep notes. Maybe grab a notebook that you want to call your crisis planning notebook. And that's where all of your information is going to be stored that you're keeping, so that you know where it is at all times. I think we had one parent one time tell us that they kind of have a crisis card that they keep, an index card that they keep on them, like in their purse. So when they leave the house, it's on them. It's an easy access in the home when they're at home, but they know where. In this card involves all the information that they need, who they're going to call, the hospital that they'll typically go to, that information.
That's a really good tip. You know, with our generation, I feel like we get so used to everything in our phones. But what if we're not at home and we don't have access to the internet or our computer, or our phone dies and we don't have access to our charger, because we rely so much on Google. So to have that information on hand in our purse is an
Hmm.
excellent tip.
Yes. And if you're like me, I always forget to charge my phone. I'm that person that has just a little bit of bar left, and I just go, oh, I hope this lasts me. So, yeah, it's just one of those things where we are becoming very dependent on phones and having that second backup plan, if you will. So, you know, you can be doing all the planning in the world, but, sometimes a crisis just happens. So what happens during a crisis? What are some tips to kind of you might want to jot down? I mean, even having tips like breathing, take a deep breath, keeping calm, keep the conversation focused on the child, having the child's medical information available, um, being mindful of the child is present in the room. These sometimes are things that our brains, when we're in that crisis moment, flight or fight, we might forget. There are those people that I call them superhumans that have the ability in any crisis to kind of slow down, that like time slows down and they see everything clearly. And I feel like those are the people that become, first responders or doctors or somebody in the medical profession. Um, but many times that's not the case. We want to think that we can have that superpower, but many times it doesn't work that way. So just having these tips again written down somewhere in maybe your crisis book. I mentioned the index card earlier. The parent who mentioned that, she also includes the child's medical information on that index card at all times so that she has it on her. And then keeping good records. I'm bringing back the notebook. I know people use their phones. People are probably thinking that's a very archaic way to do things, Mary Beth. I don't keep a notebook. I keep my phone. That's totally fine. If you use your phone for note taking, absolutely okay. I'm just saying keep something on you that you can write down notes and keep good records. Joe saw Dr. Fizzy Water today and they prescribed XYZ. Like keeping those notes so that you can go back and refer to them if you have questions, or just keep them for your own records. So again, some questions to think about as you're going through this. And again, if we don't answer them, let us know. But if your child is hospitalized, what are some questions that you think you might need to ask? And again, this is a very broad question, and this is something that you probably want to take a minute and maybe do some self-reflecting on, and a little homework assignment, if you will. But putting that in your notebook, what are questions you always ask every single time you go to the hospital? And that way you won't forget and you have them written down or in your phone. Again, I'm a notebook person.
I think also prior to a crisis, I didn't even think about what about the families that have siblings.
Mm.
Not preparing just the child that, because you never know which child in the family is going to have a crisis, right? But what if we just all talk about crisis and normalize it? Like, we are all capable of having a crisis in our life. It could be one of the parents, but it could also be a sibling. And what do we do in that event? And I think having that conversation with our children is also really helpful, because it's going to be a shock for the entire family once it happens without being prior just discussed.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's collaborative. Yeah, it needs to be a full family discussion, because if you have younger children, and one of your children is TDO'd for 120 hours, and you can't leave that child, what happens? So those little details of like, you don't. It's one of those things where it's better to know that in advance than during the crisis when you're all over the place.
Right.
So after crisis, because it does happen, it might not feel like it in the moment. A crisis is all consuming, and it might be difficult to see the light at the end, but it is there. It's a finite amount of time. And eventually you'll find yourself coming out of this crisis as a family. So what do you need to kind of think about? We mentioned this earlier. Record, record, record. Details are important. What happened? Not all crises are the same, um, or they may not be the same. I don't want to say that they all aren't the same, but they may not be the same. So writing down details can be helpful just to kind of for your own um, memory, for your own memory bank. Um, this is kind of part of the process of releasing the child after the TDO, but just notifying if your child does have a standard mental health provider, to kind of alert them of what has happened. Um, Especially if they're hospitalized, they may have changes occur to their treatment while they're hospitalized. So it's important that the full team is kind of made aware of these changes. If they're not, typically the provider is notified while the child's hospitalized, but just something to consider and think about. If you don't have a provider for your child, probably after this, you will. So it's kind of one of those things like, who is that going to be, in writing that information down? And just kind of pulling the team together. Bianca mentioned this. She mentioned CSA. She mentioned bringing in a family support partner. She mentioned the CSB services, creating that team that come around you and the child to create steps, a safety plan to prevent um, the crisis, to help kind of mitigate those triggers or those stressors that brought on the crisis to begin with. So some techniques to de-escalate. So that's something that they really discuss after the fact is, okay, we say after the crisis to talk about this because, again, while you're in the middle of a crisis, the purpose is to get out of the crisis, is to get through it. And then you can take that time to be like, okay, let's reflect and have some processing time and think about a safety plan now that we can actually breathe a little bit and look at this as a big picture. All right, Bianca.
So for our family plan, once we came out of the crisis, you know, there's always going to be the possibility of a little bit of post-traumatic stress disorder for all of us now after that. And I think that's a really key point that when we go into crisis and then we're in crisis and then after crisis, we don't realize how traumatic those events can be for all of us. And so personally, I've woke up some mornings worrying about my son. Is he, and this is a parent's worst nightmare to have to go through. But personally, for me, I do think about my son often in the middle of the night. We do have cameras all around the house, indoors and out, just to, provide an extra way of safety for our family to feel safe. But I do worry about him, and I think that's very natural. However, it's important to understand the word secondary trauma, that although my son has post-traumatic stress disorder and he has self-harming and suicide ideation tendencies, that can cause stress in itself for parents. And so my number one lived experience comment I have is how important respite is for the entire family. So we did come up with a plan for after crisis, and we talk about how important not only respite is for ourselves, but for our son as well. So especially with this pandemic and spending the last 365 days plus more now that it's over a year, it is really important that we understand as a family that respite is really wonderful for all of us. We also review the safety plan often with our son's providers and constantly keep that up to date because things change. Like this pandemic caused a lot of changes in all of our lives. We continuously communicate with the school, not only the teachers, but also the admin. And of course, with the IEP process, we inform and update the psychiatrist of any changes in his behavior. We practice coping mechanisms at home. So, when he went to the psychiatric hospital, they made lots of lists of what worked for them and what didn't, what causes or triggered, his episodes. And so we also think it's important that we practice those coping mechanisms while we're stable and we're calm, so that when we do feel we're in a crisis or we are not regulated, the coping mechanisms come into place naturally. And so based on circumstances, the plan that we have is either to call a therapist or go to the hospital, like we've already done in the past, and we're kind of all aware of what works best for our family. And last but not least, very important is self-care. So respite is important. That's a number one thing for our families, but so is self-care. So what are we doing as a family to do things that um, is not only respite considered, but also are we taking time out for ourselves? Even if it's taking a walk, like my husband and I take a walk almost every day after dinner or before dinner, and it's just my husband and I. Some days we'll include our son, but it just depends on the day. But that's my husband, and that's our self-care. And that's a time that we get to sit with each other and talk and spend time. But there's lots of self-care techniques out there for parents. But I do just want to remind you that our children need self-care as well. So just to remind everybody that, we are all human, and it's helpful to have the respite and the self-care, and those are major parts of our after crisis in our continued planning for our family.
Well said, Bianca. I feel like we should end on that. But I did want to just to play off of what Bianca just said, just some final thoughts, and I think we've pretty much covered a lot of this over the course of this presentation. But every family situation is different. Not every crisis looks the same. Not every crisis response looks the same for every family. There's that standard response that we have in the state of Virginia, but again, could look different per family. So what worked for others might not work for you. So just keep that in mind. It's not, there's no wrong way to manage a crisis. We're just all working through it together. No matter what happens, trust your gut. This is big. You are the expert on your child. Just again, that's something that we really hone in on with, especially with family support. And what we do as an organization is to push that family voice forward. If you have a conflict with a provider you're working with, that's okay. It's normal. We're all human. We might not get along, and it's okay to maybe ask for a different provider, see if that's a possibility, just to kind of keep that in mind. This might be difficult while you're in a crisis, but just sticking to facts and giving clear examples. It's an emotional experience, but being able to get across what your needs are in a way where people will respond. So it's helpful. And so just be able to kind of stick to what is happening. What are the facts that are going on right now? Ask questions, ask so many questions. You can never ask too many questions. Ask. And use the planning guide that we're going to provide as part of the additional part of this presentation. Afterwards, you'll be able to click on it, but write your own plan. Like Bianca said, that's her story, and that's her plan for her family. And what your plan might look different. Again, every family situation is different. So on that note, here are some resources to keep in mind. We'll be posting this presentation on our website, so you'll be able to pause, see it, take a screenshot if you want, but just some helpful tools to get you through. Here are some national resources that we promote that we think are helpful. So just things to think about. And on that note, I just want to say thank you for joining us. Again, if you have any questions that we did not answer, or potentially questions that came up throughout the course of this presentation that you would like us to talk about, please join us on May 1st. If you're registered for the summit, we're going to be available from 10 to 12 to do a breakout session for this. So please join us, and we will see you then. And if not, we hope you have a wonderful rest of your day and enjoy your summer.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone. I don't know where to stop recording this. Okay. I've recorded. I paused. No, screen sharing is no.